Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Modes. I'm your host, Rachel Premack. Today we're going to be discussing a topic that I started coming across since I started covering the freight industry, and that's this trend of trains getting longer and longer. So when I first really started learning about this topic was in 2019, the federal government released a study about the length of freight trains, which was definitely a topic that caught my eye. Didn't know much about it, but they found that from 2008 to 2017, the average train length at the two Class 1 railroads that shared data with them, that average length increased by about 25%, and some trains were nearly 3 miles long. So that's, of course, good for rail carriers. It's seemingly good for customers, but there are a lot of unintended consequences. I'm sure anyone who has had to sit at a railroad crossing waiting for the train to pass for 5 or 10 minutes or what have you can definitely relate to that. But to explain some of these other consequences that, us average consumers might not know about, I have Jason Doering on the show today. Welcome, Jason.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. So Jason is a longtime train engineer and conductor. He's currently at Union Pacific. He's also the Nevada State Legislative Director at the Smart TD Union. So just before we get into the train length conversation, can you give us the latest update on what's going on with rail and union labor negotiations? I feel like a lot of people were following along this topic last year, then it kind of dropped off. What's going on with these labor negotiations? Because as some might not know, there are actually 12 different rail unions. Each of them negotiate separately with these various rail companies. So yeah, tell us what's the latest at that.
Well, as we all know, what took place at the end of 2022, our national labor agreement is now active, and we currently have multiple on-property negotiations that are dealing with sick leave that, like you said, are together with a bunch of different other labor organizations. I represent Smart TD. I'm on the legislative side of things, but currently on CSX property, sick days were recently negotiated, and there is a tentative agreement that's currently awaiting ratification vote. So it seems like a few of the properties are beginning to realize how detrimental the hiring process is, and finally, we've been shouting this for quite a while that we do not have paid sick time, and the sick time that we do take, we're subject to the carrier's attendance policy, and so in reality, on most of the properties, if you were to lay off sick over a holiday weekend, it could place you in a situation where you could be dismissed from that carrier. So the progress that a lot of these general committees are making with the on-property negotiations is definitely a good sign moving forward, and hopefully more will take action to remedy the effects of the attendance issues and the work-life balance that we've been talking about for years now.
And are any of these agreements, are they going beyond what the national agreement was? Is there any sort of like added benefits that are coming out of this negotiation, or is it pretty much just sticking to that national agreement of, I believe it was 2 paid sick days a year, as well as that medical leave? Yeah, kind of refresh my memory. Is there anything beyond that national agreement that we've seen so far?
Right. So each property will begin again. I think they are in the process of negotiating on each term within those general committees. So each property is broken up into different committees to where each of those specific committees will negotiate on property agreements. So like the one that is taking place on CSX, they provide 5 paid sick days with the option to convert the 2 personal days to paid sick days. Those unused days are converted to cash at the end of the year with the option to defer those to the 401k. So I think each property will inevitably have different terms, but I think the overall goal is, again, just to allow for paid sick time to and also be able to schedule it at a moment's notice rather than so far in advance.
Yeah, because no one knows when they're going to be sick, or else
Right.
they'd probably just avoid being sick in the first place. So now getting into the train length conversation, kind of looking back at this, I came across this chart from the Association for American Railroads, which represents rail companies rather than rail workers, of course. And it's interesting looking at this. If we can put this chart up on the screen, and those of you who are maybe listening to this on the podcast are not looking at your screen right now. Basically, what this shows is that from 2010 to 2022, the median train length, which is in that orange, has increased from just over 4,000 feet to just under 6,000 feet. So sticking around that mile type length. But when we go to that 90th percentile or even that 99th percentile of trains, those trains have gone from 10,000 feet, about just under 2 miles, to 14,000 feet, which is nearly 3 miles from 2010 to 2022. And for those of you who are big modes heads, my feeling about, super large ships. Just over the past few decades, we've seen ocean cargo ships, get bigger and bigger in size. So anyways, just kind of talking about this, tell us, Jason, what it's like to work on these trains that are, 1 mile long, that median, 1 mile long versus, a 2 to 3 mile long train. Like what's kind of what kind of like sticky issues, I guess, come up when you're dealing with these like incredibly long trains?
Yeah, I mean, first to start out, these long trains are fairly new concept. I mean, they've really taken hold since the introduction of PSR. So obviously PSR, the intentions are to have fewer crews out there, so trains get longer. But when I started with the railroad, a long train was around 7,500 feet, and that was a fairly large train. And the reason for that was the infrastructure. So most of the sidings are able to accommodate just slightly over a mile of length. Now, we do have these larger sidings, but for a majority of them, at least in the territory that I run, they accommodated the trains that were being run at that time. And now we're just seeing that the carriers are beginning to push the limit as far as they can. And it seems like it's an experimental phase to where there is no limit. I've seen some Transportation Research Board studies where these trains are running slightly under 5 miles and in excess of 64,000 tons, which is just, it's unbelievable. But on the operating side of things, it definitely affects both the conductor and the engineer. I think our number one issue is really the communication. On the engineer's side of it, we run what is referred to as distributed power locomotives. So when you see a train, you might see some locomotives on the head end, some in the middle, and some on the rear. And those are all satellite linked, and together they're working together while the engineer is controlling them all from the head end. And when you have these excessively long trains in territories that might not be flat and have mountains or any other interferences, having those DPs so far from the head end or not only the DPs, but the end of train device that monitors the air brake pressure for the engineer at the rear of the train, they lose communication a lot. And that affects how the engineer essentially operates that train, whether if that train could be stuck in a certain dynamic brake or stuck in a certain notch of power, and until it regains communication, it'll continue that way, which definitely affects the fluidity of the train. And on the conductor's end of it, if these trains snap in two or snap in three, that conductor is having to walk back on ballast that is usually uneven, or in some cases they're walking in, at least in Nevada here, just south of we got Donner Pass, which, as you're aware of all the snow that they've received during the wintertime, having to walk in those treacherous conditions for 3+ miles to try to remedy an issue that was caused by these excessive lengths, it puts a strain on that conductor. And for some of us in southern Nevada, being just south of Death Valley in the summer in the extreme heat, walking on just terrain that isn't meant to be walked on, but rather for the rails, it's a very unfortunate way of doing things. But communication, I would say, as far as these excessive lengths, is really tough, especially when you throw in weather into it. But there's many other things that affect these long trains. You got the inspection times. They've decreased to move these massive trains out of the yards. They don't want terminal congestion. So a lot of the carmen that are responsible for inspecting the cars and the locomotives prior to them departing the terminal are getting pressure to hurry up and get it out of there, which again is a huge rail safety concern. Also, in a lot of these yards, you have multiple crossings or right outside the yard, so blocked crossings is a huge impact. We've had a bill in Nevada where we were pressing for long train legislation, and we had a few emergency responders, the firefighters, show up to testify in support of our bill because they have been blocked and unable to get to an emergency situation in downtown Las Vegas, where these massive trains are blocking, a lifeline to possibly save a life there. But also long trains in turn make themselves heavier. So you got increased braking distance. It makes it more difficult to stop. It takes more power to start these trains. And again, that goes hand in hand with train makeup, which has been getting a lot of light lately because of the placement of these cars and how they mix loads and empties together. Another thing would be, the infrastructure. Most of the track throughout the country is single main line. So when you're trying to run multiple trains that are just excessively long, they need to meet at some point. And that's where the sidings come into play. And again, a lot of these sidings are unable to fit these huge trains in there for not only other freight trains to pass, but also Amtrak that does share those tracks. So many times, at least here in Nevada, up in northern Nevada, that California Zephyr is constantly caught behind these trains and unable to pass. So you're running these Amtrak trains that should be scooting down the rail, likely at 10 miles per hour for many, many miles.
Jason, I want to ask you a little bit about, I know there's probably a million issues.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you really quick about the communication. So with an engineer and a conductor on one of these trains, where are you guys like on the train? Like how far apart are you? Because I in previous conversations I've had with conductors and engineers, it sounds like sometimes they're in the same car, sometimes they're apart. Can you kind of like walk us through what that looks like as personally someone who's never operated a train? And I imagine some of our listeners also haven't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of the trains that you see that are, online or out on the main line, you have, again, those units on the head end. You might see multiple units throughout the train or a few on the head end, but the conductor and engineer and sometimes a third crew member, a brakeman, will always be in that head end unit when they're running down the main line. So you have two qualified, an engineer and a qualified conductor up there, likely inside of a terminal, or if you see in industry being serviced, then you'll have a situation where the engineer is likely on the head end, where the conductor or brakeman are down on the ground performing the service.
Okay. And so it's not like you're ever really, obviously you wouldn't be moving while the train is in motion. You kind of just pick where you're going to go and then stay there for however long, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, so on the main line, I mean, our hours of service allows for 12 hours. So, I mean, most of the time we do work up into those 12 hours. So we're usually on the head end for 12 plus hours performing that service.
And you mentioned the idea of a train snapping in 2 or 3. That definitely, sounded some alarm bells for me. Can you explain a little bit like how often that happens and why that might happen?
Yeah, I mean, it used to not happen so much, obviously, because you didn't have the air brake issues mostly. I mean, the shorter the train, the less mechanical failures that you have. And when you're operating these trains of this magnitude, we still are using a technology that was still in the Civil War era, where all the brakes are ran through air. So they all release at a certain time, and then they set at a certain time, and it's kind of like a big slinky. So when you have these large trains, it takes a lot more time for the air to either release, which will give you the ability to move your train, or to set up, which gives your train the ability to stop. So when you also combine that with that distributive power that I was talking about, when you have locomotives in the middle of the train and the rear of the train, again, you're messing with the fluidity, and it can cause a lot of movement on that rail, and it's kind of like metal fatigue that it'll give it. So it's not only just affecting the cars and that train and the knuckles that are kind of coupled together to keep those cars together, but it also has a large impact on the rail, to where we're seeing more broken rail and lots of issues with the infrastructure as well, because they weren't never designed to move this much weight or have trains this long on certain curves. It's been a real challenge, I imagine, on the engineering side of things as well.
So yeah, I'm just picturing like the idea of this technology being from the 1800s. I assume they were never intending for trains to be 2-3 miles long. So the idea of these trains kind of breaking, is there like is there a risk factor, I guess, for when a train is more likely to snap in two or three? I mean, I imagine, if the train is particularly long, that's more likely. Is it also maybe you're hauling particularly heavy freight, or there's a specific kind of terrain? Like, what kind of are the risk factors for this to happen?
I mean, using my territory as an example, Nevada has a lot of heavy grade. So most of the rail that I operate on is 1% or greater. So when you are starting off on a 1% grade, you have to have those locomotives working before you can release the air brakes, or else you're just going to roll back. So you're putting a lot of force on the locomotive to try to get it moving prior to the brakes releasing. So on a shorter and a lighter train, it would be much easier to release your brakes and get that train moving and not have so much force, in-train forces on those knuckles. But when you're dealing with these massive trains, it takes sometimes doing an air brake test on these massive trains could take upwards of an hour because of weather conditions. When it's colder, the air doesn't move quite as well. So in the wintertime, the carriers are forced to slightly reduce the length of their trains just because the air brakes won't set or release if they continue to run them miles in length. But it truly is a different way of operating a train that is miles long compared to one that is shorter. But I would say terrain and weather play a significant factor in how these trains break. And then not only that is just the wear and tear on the equipment. I mean, these cars have now been beat up for many years since the induction of PSR, to where they're not used to that. They're not made to have these much forces in front and behind them. And I think that's playing a factor. I mean, they're just tearing apart. My assistant director testified and used a term that these cars are cracking like eggs. And it really is something significant to see what damage can be done with just a few thousand more tons than we're used to running with.
And my understanding is that these really long trains tend to be what's called unit trains, where it's just one customer, one type of freight, maybe coal, let's say, for example, maybe more so out here in the Northeast. But like what tends to be running on these 2+ mile long trains?
I think it's a mixed commodity of everything, especially out west. We'll see a mixture of it. Intermodal trains are really pressing the limits, especially in Nevada, as how long they'll build them. But mixed manifest, we had an incident in California with a train that was oversized and has been on the union's radar for quite some time, as it is underpowered and excessively long and heavy, which has caused multiple issues. But that was an iron ore train. They've attempted doubling up coal trains and running them over territories that they shouldn't be able to do. But I would say it's really any kind of commodity out there, which, as we saw in East Palestine, a mixed manifest train, they're really just pressing the limits and really experimenting with whatever they can throw together and as quickly as they can throw together, just to impact that terminal dwell time and get it moving as fast as they can, with safety definitely falling by the wayside.
Okay.
And the
Jason,
training
thank you so much for walking.
associated with that. as well is I'm a locomotive engineer as well, and I have never really been taught on how to operate these long trains. We have operating rules and we have suggestions on how we should do this, written rules on how we should operate these trains, but being out online and actually having an instructor teach you how to ultimately run these multiple distributed power trains and being put on simulator training to safely run these is not happening. And that concerns me as well, because I'm close to being running as well with nearly 20 years of seniority as a conductor. I haven't been able to work as an engineer the entire time, and I'm likely about to get picked up. And while I've had some on-the-job training as a locomotive engineer recently, being put out on your own, especially when the limits of these excessive train lengths are just being stretched daily, it's nerve-wracking. And on the territory that we run, it makes you think, especially after a major incident like we had on this iron ore train recently.
Yeah, it seems like unions and rail workers know which trains it is that are going to pose a problem in the future. So just kind of raising those flags and looking after that, I think is definitely really important. Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show. And where can people connect with you online if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at JT Doering, and then for our Smart Nevada State Legislative Board, it's just at Smart NVSLB, and that'll take you to all of our social media accounts, and then you can follow us at smart-union.org.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Yep, thank you, Rachel.
Stop.